Today in our Humans of Cyber series, we welcome Jane Dargie. Jane is the president of Jane Dargie Consulting Services in Toronto. She has over 20 years of compliance, assurance, governance, and risk management experience with a specialty in privacy protection. She supports organizations and multi-stakeholder projects by designing, implementing, operating, and assessing privacy solutions. Jane has worked with private and public sector companies, large and small, often on IT, innovation, and change management initiatives. She has a specialty in health, public sector, and technology, and experience with Canadian, EU, and American privacy legislation and regulations. She holds numerous security and project management certifications and is a certified information privacy professional in Europe. Her law degree and master's in business and IT are from UK universities. Welcome, Jane, and thanks so much for taking the time to meet with us today.
Thank you, David.
So to start off, could you tell us a little bit about the evolution of privacy awareness in Canada? Do you believe that technology is the main driver?
Yeah, certainly. So if we talk about the last 100 years or so, we would look at privacy as being the right to be let alone originally. And Canada, like many other countries, started to deal more formally with privacy in terms of legislation in the 80s. And that followed, a number of decades post-war, where there was a recognition of human rights and what we would call the right to self-determination and the appreciation of privacy from a human rights perspective. So we had the conventions that were developed post-war. And so it was set in that context. And as we got into the 80s, we started to see the Federal Privacy Act, which was public sector legislation, with those underpinnings, all about really the relationship between the state and the individual. And then eventually we get into the evolution of privacy legislation with the data protection directive in the EU. And one of the most significant features about that was that personal information or personal data in the EU should not be transmitted to other jurisdictions unless they had an adequate level of privacy protection in place. So really this was about barriers to trade and the ability to share information across borders. So certainly there's an element of technology, but there was a bigger context to it. And by the time we get to when our current federal private sector legislation was enacted, going into the early 2000s, absolutely there was a technology element to that. It was in the kind of .com environment, and privacy was certainly being more heavily influenced by technology at that point too. So yes, technology's been part of it, but we can't forget the importance of the kind of fundamental human rights dimension to it as well.
Right. Now, you have extensive privacy experience in Europe, Canada, and the US. Why does it seem that Europe always seems to be ahead of the curve when it comes to privacy?
Well, I would say part of it's cultural. I mean, there may be arguments about whether or not Europe has always been further ahead, but certainly cultural. And as we talked about the creation of the EU and that having to navigate the flows of information between member states, there's certainly a political dimension to it as well, which is translated into the heavy focus on legislation.
So how do you see the relationship between data privacy and data security?
Well, good question. I think sometimes we use these terms interchangeably, so it's important to be able to kind of differentiate, but also think about the overlaps between them. So if we're thinking about security in a kind of traditional definition of that, we're looking at the confidentiality and the integrity and the availability of information. And that could be information that's sensitive for many reasons and not just because it's about identifiable individuals. Privacy is about individuals and their rights. It's about personally identifiable information, so information about either an identified individual or that you may be able to identify the individual using the information. And so privacy concepts get into things like consent and individuals' rights to consent to the collection, use, and disclosure of their personal information. So it's not just about being authorized to access information. It goes beyond to the right to be able to say no to the collection, use, or disclosure of your information. Privacy addresses rights also like being able to see your information and understand how it's being used and have it corrected in some cases if it's inaccurate. So if you think about the protection of information as being a common component to dealing with privacy and security, there's these additional rights and obligations from a privacy perspective that go beyond. So to give you an example of that in practice, I'm sure a few years ago everyone became aware of going through an airport and you all of a sudden had to deal with not just a human kind of pat down, but going through a system where your body would be scanned and to identify any kind of suspicious things that you were hiding. So if you think about that from a security perspective, you're not necessarily considering that people may have medical devices or, the shapes and contours of their body and what you might display in a body scanner. So when some of these body scanners were initially implemented, people could actually see an awful lot about the person's body, the person who's being scanned. Whereas if that had been implemented in a privacy protective way, it would have been more like your kind of chalk outline of a body with maybe X's marking the spot where a human could go and do a pat down or follow up to investigate further. So that's an example of privacy by design and just a reminder of how you can have great security but not good privacy, and that you really need to think beyond to deal with privacy effectively.
Now, Canada's existing privacy laws, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA for short. It can be daunting for larger firms, even with the resources and legal teams they have to manage a project. So how can SMBs manage to deal with privacy compliance in this kind of regime?
Well, first of all, that's right, that there's complexity to it. But I think what it really boils down to is good information management practices and awareness. The privacy commissioners have published a lot of tools and guides. So the Federal Privacy Commissioner of Canada has some really great information on the website. A self-assessment questionnaire, for example, where you can go through and look at the key safeguards that you would want to have in place in your organization and look at whether or not you have them. So that will help you develop a plan and get a sense of privacy risk in your organization. They've also got things like mini training clips and backgrounders and, even ideas and tools and that kind of thing. So there's an awful lot of information that's publicly available, tools that can help organizations of all sizes.
Right, definitely a lot of great resources out there. So in your experience, if a company is looking to start a formal privacy program, what is the first thing that they should do?
Oh, great question. Well, happily, some of our privacy commissioners, we've got privacy commissioners across Canada dealing with the federal private sector legislation as well as at a provincial level. And there's a fantastic guide to developing what we would call a privacy management program that's publicly available. And this is actually really important because the proposed modernizations to our PIPEDA will require organizations to have a privacy management program in place. But really a first step to that, it gets into saying, well, what kind of information do we have and where is it in our organization? What kind of personal information do we have? And so doing an inventory of that, helping to figure out which organizations you may be working with as service providers and they may have access to your personal information. So there's a level setting exercise to figure out really what you do today with personal information. And that would be step one, because if you don't have those basic answers, you can't assess your privacy risk and you're unable to identify whether you're privacy compliant. The other thing, of course, is having a champion, and our legislation today does require there to be a person who's designated as being accountable for privacy. And often I find organizations find it useful to have some privacy champions in different parts of their businesses. So people who really know those aspects of the business well, they're going to really understand what's going on with personal information and what kind of information practices the organization has today. So bringing them together into some kind of working group will really stand you in good stead.
Yeah, no, great points. Another important aspect I would think is training and general within the company. Anecdotally, I see new hires at companies that are very reliant on technology, and they still don't offer cybersecurity or privacy training. What do we do to change this kind of mindset here in 2021?
Well, I mean, one thing I see is that people are a bit overwhelmed with training, often in organizations, or maybe they think that they're not quite sure how to approach privacy training. I mean, we're told to train people about what the legal obligations are, but often that's quite high level and people don't really understand what that meaningfully requires them to do or not do on a day-to-day basis. So I think a more modern view of training is that you're going to talk about scenarios. What do I need to do in order to be able to do my job? And so if you bring it down to that very practical level, I think people get an awful lot more out of training, and the organization does too. This is about culture. It's about helping people be aware. We may not expect everybody to have a detailed understanding of exactly how the law applies. That's why you would have a privacy officer in the organization to guide and oversee. But for most people, there's some very basic things that they should be being told to do or not do. And so if your privacy training can impart the essentials with an appreciation of the legislation, it's usually a lot more meaningful. And so today, I mean, again, our privacy commissioners have training videos. There's a lot of organizations that are providing training online that people can tap into, and they're not having to create it from themselves. I would say that, I mean, there's training that needs to happen on pieces of privacy legislation and how that applies to their organization, and that's usually where you need to supplement it as a privacy officer to kind of add to the day-to-day about what people should be doing or not doing. But training is another example of an absolute expectation of our legislation today and to comply with it, and that's only going to become more marked with the new legislation as well.
Right. Now, you mentioned the new legislation, and it looks like 2021 might be the year that it finally comes into effect. What should companies be doing to prepare for this new legislation coming through?
Well, I think it depends on the stage of maturity. If we take an organization that maybe doesn't have a privacy program today, the first thing would be taking some of the steps we've discussed this morning, figuring out how to design a privacy management program. And really getting down to the information you have in the organization today, what your privacy risk may be, and also what your privacy strategy is. Because today, yes, organizations need to comply with the law, but if you think about it from the customer's perspective, there's really an advantage of looking broader than compliance with legislation. It's about trust, it's about reputation. And figuring that out and as part of your work on designing the privacy management program. So the absolute fundamentals, know what kind of information you have, know where your personal information is, what kind of risks are there today, start to put a plan together for how to address them. That will stand all organizations in good stead for complying with not just the legislation today, but future legislation. And then also start scanning the environment for new information about the new legislation and some new rights and obligations that will bring. So, for example, we're expecting a right for individuals, it's a qualified right, but a right nonetheless for individuals to come and ask to have their information deleted. So start thinking if you're designing new technology or acquiring technology, how would you go about doing those types of things? And we have we talked about other jurisdictions, so these are rights that are coming into force or already in force in other places. So there's a lot we can learn from them too about implementation in Canada to get ready.
Right. No, that makes sense. Now I note that the first reading of the bill is available online, but it can be rather open. Where should people go to learn more about the coming changes from a layman's perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly true. There's a big difference between reading legislation and kind of figuring out how it's going to be applied in practice. So, I mean, we're fairly early days, so what's in the black letter of the law will undoubtedly change a bit before it's finally enacted. But I would look at industry associations, because they're going to start publishing stuff online about their interpretation of the law and what it might mean for your sector. Privacy Commissioner of Canada's website will be a great resource too. So I would look at those. Two law firms will start to issue periodicals as well. But really, this is also about having a base understanding of privacy as well. And so tools like the Federal Privacy Commissioners or the Group of Privacy Commissioners Guide to Privacy Management Programs, those are great things to start joining up on as well.
Okay, great resources. Thank you. Now, both the current legislation and the coming changes are often framed as pretty onerous for business. How have you seen companies turn that around and make privacy a strategy and a benefit rather than thinking of it as a burden?
Mm-hmm. Well, this also gets into what we would call privacy by design, and the idea of if you're designing like a customer service or a technology, thinking about how you can build privacy in from the start. So this is it's important to think about the customer's experience and what kind of things may they be concerned about from a privacy perspective, and how can you build privacy in from the start. So one of our design goals of privacy by design is privacy by default. So the kind of classic example is don't automatically send marketing communications. You got to think about consent. So are you going to explain to somebody in very plain language about how you collect, use, and disclose their information? That would be a really good starting point. It's actually something that will be become even more important. But thinking about communicating from the customer's perspective, you can't expect that they know a lot of jargon or exactly how your organization works. So just putting yourself in the mind of the consumer and considering what they may expect of your organization is going to be really important as you go through that relationship with them.
Yes, the privacy by design principles are really important to bake it in instead of bolting on privacy considerations after the fact. Now, it was Data Privacy Day just recently, back on January 20th. What are Canadians doing today that puts their privacy at risk that they should be aware of?
Well, one thing that people do is give out a lot of information without necessarily thinking about how it could be misused or get passed on to other people. So I'm going to use myself as an example here. I was out and about a couple of years ago, and a chocolate company was giving out free samples, which was fantastic for me because I love chocolate. But what they wanted in return was a photo of you holding the bar of chocolate with a big grin in your face, or whatever the case may be. So in that situation, it was a quid pro quo. Like, do I really want my photo to be out there? And you may say, well, what's the harm with that? But when we look recently, even in the last couple of weeks, about an organization that had been scraping photos online and then making them available to law enforcement, basically putting members of the public into effectively a lineup without their knowledge. And our privacy commissioners came out and said that was actually contrary to our Canadian privacy legislation. But here you have a private sector organization that has done this without people's knowledge, likely without their expectation. So it's just a good reminder to all of us to be mindful about what we're doing, and certainly things like photos and like voice prints and a lot of these kind of biometric pieces to be particularly careful of. Anything around identity documents, a lot of the time we get asked to show them, or people are recording information from them. ask them why they need it. Do they really need it, or do they just need to see it? So these are some basic things that we may do without thinking about it. And as a result, we're exposing ourselves to identity theft and exposure in a surveillance capacity.
Right. And social media a big part of that problem as well.
Absolutely.
So what are some other strategies that people like to protect their privacy online, and what can business do to help?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think people being mindful, learning generally about technology. I mean, there's all the statistics about the number of hours a year people would actually take if they read every privacy policy, and it's just unreasonable to expect that. But I think if we're generally inquisitive about and thoughtful about how we give out our information or what we say and when we say it, or photos and so forth, that's going to stand us in a really good stead. From a business perspective, data minimization, which is collecting a level of information that's proportionate and really minimal to the purpose that you have in mind, is a really important strategy for protecting privacy. You don't want to collect information that's overbroad for your purpose, because once you have it, you have to protect it. And we all know that organizations are prone to data breaches through inadvertence or lack of control. So if you don't have it in the first place, then you are reducing your risk. So I think the same strategy, both for individuals and businesses, is a really core tenet to apply.
No, it makes sense. Those are all the questions I have. So I really appreciate your time. So thank you very much for visiting with us today. How can the interested readers and listeners stay in touch with you? Is LinkedIn the best channel?
That would be lovely. I would enjoy connecting with people. And thank you for the opportunity to chat this morning.
Okay. Well, that's all for today. We'll see you next time on Humans of Cyber.